Hello. Welcome to part 6 of the Unobstructed Way. Good news for pets, aging as a Neanderthal superstition, and the meaning of life, no less. We'll be looking at the problems of spiritual anemia and oversensitivity, what it is exactly that Betty called, quote, the spiritual sense, unquote, and Betty's descriptions of death and finding oneself in the afterlife. Let's get started with good news for pets and their people. Most religions exclude animals from heaven since they are said not to have souls. Stewart wanted to know what Betty had to say about that. He reported the conversation in The Unobstructed Universe. Quote, how about dogs? Have you got dogs in your world? Unquote. He asked. Quote, of course I have my dogs, and I love them, unquote, Betty replied. Quote, then they continue on individually as you do, as dogs, I mean, unquote. Betty responded, quote, the individual is immortal, unquote. Later, Betty clarified. She explained that an amoeba would not return as an individual. Its quality and quantity of consciousness are not enough for the use of reason and will. To use the will under the guidance of reason is a power demonstrated by almost any pet in search of a snack and present in all mammals and pretty much all creatures except for the simplest. In his book, The Stars Are Still There, Stewart shared his response to the bereaved family of two murdered dogs. He told them that Betty explained that many animals are born from the quality of consciousness that defines their species, and to it they return as if to a reservoir. But animals that attain will and reason develop personalities, and they, quote, do carry on as individuals, unquote. Stewart added, quote, Betty says that eventually, in the expansion of consciousness, the dog form will not fit, and then it will have some other form. She did not go further into details, unquote. Now let us consider the concept of spiritual anemia. The great Irish poet and mystic William Butler Yeats famously lamented that the most soulful among us seem to lack the vigor and success of the beasts slouching to their Bethlehems. No amount of enlightenment can compare to sheer animal spirits when it comes to making things happen in the material world. Spirituality can exasperate the problem, especially in the early stages of spiritual experience, when beginners are most susceptible to spiritual anemia. In the unobstructed, Betty saw people in a different way than we do. She saw character, or the lack of it. Those who lacked honor, stamina, and the other virtues of character, she described as gelatinous. They could not pull together a form or a coherent identity. Like being lost in a dream, they didn't know how or what they were creating. They were simply pulled and pushed by whatever attracted their attention and whatever attention they attracted. Of course, the result of a gelatinous life must be a gelatinous afterlife where we lose ourselves, never fulfilling our missions, if we remember them at all. How do we avoid the supreme regret of a wasted life? The Invisibles advise us to, quote, watch carefully, guard your thought chambers, unquote. After all, as we know all too well, wrong thinking can get us into trouble. The Invisibles suggested we, quote, Allow full scope in all directions until they begin to create undesirable, dragging, or belittling things. Then destroy these misbegotten things without looking at them, by flooding them, overwhelming them with the raw material for a new and better structure. Repeat this operation continuously whenever barnacles collect, unquote. These, quote, misbegotten things, unquote, are also called, quote, blood-sucking little things, unquote. We're told that everything we pay attention to takes a little time from us, a little energy. Betty compares it to a tax. Lives are wasted, given away in bits and pieces. An emotionally traumatic relationship here, a bad job experience there, a grudge nursed, the TV series we can't miss, a few hours online every day, and the miscellaneous details of daily living can use up our energy, leaving none for cultivating our souls. Never having developed the spiritual sense, with no identity, only the habit of reacting, forgetfulness can take the soul, even in the afterlife. The Invisibles explained, quote, consider one who is without firmly established supporting convictions previously developed through his having constructed his own firm conditions of maintenance elsewhere, without the eternal truth of equilibrium, without the surrounding stability of confidence in his own power of reestablishment through summoning or magnetically attracting to himself the same replacement conditions anywhere, unquote. What happens then when a soul crosses to the unobstructed without spiritual stability? Quote, he will begin at once to disintegrate and throw into confusion his whole creative mechanism by tearing it up into little worry bits as to food and every detail of present and future need and his lack of possession of them at the moment. His panic over his mechanism of reconstructing his life puts him at once into the conditions he fears, unquote. The Invisibles here echo the Tibetan concept of the bardos, worlds or dimensions where souls wander lost, reacting helplessly to the apparitions of their fears and desires, mistaking them for demons and gods, until the fateful desire that their karma has ripened sends them into another incarnation where they may or may not get a chance to attain enlightenment and liberation from the wheel of reincarnation. According to the Invisibles, perhaps the greatest challenge to spiritual development is the physical denial so many religions have taught. Extensive fasting, austere disciplines, rigid denial of natural physical functions are not only unnecessary, but potentially harmful. Quote, always in the earlier years of spiritual development, the effort of stilling your objective minds to reach your inner ones has certain accompanying symptoms which result in a flattening and dulling of the entity as a whole. It is just as when in a sport one uses undue effort in the beginning and exhausts oneself in doing what later can be done quite easily, unquote. Some readers may recognize the following description of the curious phenomenon of spiritual growing pains. The Invisibles explained, quote, the aching muscles of the mind and spirit sometimes interpret themselves in reflex even on the bodily muscles. A curious aging effect can be produced, coexisting with moments of increased vitality and spiritual exuberance. To overcome this interaction, the body must be made as robust as possible, unquote. An example is given to help us get a better understanding of this peculiar spirit-body dynamic. Quote, for instance, the growth and refinement of the inner being may interpret itself into anemia of the physical being, into restrictions of foods and appetites of all kinds, Actually, no such negations interact favorably on the higher centers, unquote. The invisibles are not recommending that we ignore our allergies, but they do want us to understand the dangers of self-denial. Quote, that sounds like a dangerous doctrine, but in reality, the danger is more apt to occur on the side of damaging the spontaneity of the body's functions, its buoyancy and equilibrium and youthful confidence and carelessness. Only too easily, the aspirations of the inner life misinterpret themselves into such restrictions as an overregulated child would suffer, unquote. According to the Invisibles, this is a normal stage in spiritual development. Quote, it is this passive attitude which has made people think that using the higher consciousness is an impractical way of working at things. But it is impractical only when you merely conceive a noble idea and then sit back and expect some magic to accomplish it, unquote. In contrast, we have the man of the world, quote, the brute force man, in the meantime, goes out, perhaps with a lot of destructive function and antagonism of unripened force, and tears things up, but accomplishes it somehow. The combination of these two methods is what you want, unquote. Finding the right balance between the spiritual and physical in our lives helps us transcend our limitations. The Invisibles considered this an important part of their message to readers. Quote, usually one man dreams a dream and another man takes it up, and the dreamer scorns his fixing of it as a low materialism. What these teachings are supposed to do is to open the gates of inspiration to the practical man and to give creative construction power to the one who has vision but cannot share it by producing it, unquote. Stewart described the goal. By integrating body with spirit instead of denying the body, we can achieve a higher level of existence, not only for ourselves, but also for our community. He wrote, quote, the peculiar characteristic of the present age, in contrast to that which has developed past mystics, is the jovial, healthful naturalness which it is to demonstrate. Spiritual consciousness is to be not a laboratory experiment under conditions painfully devised, but a worldwide possession thrust into the life of a new and vital race of people, unquote. The theme of universal reformation, so pervasive throughout the history of American and European metaphysical religion, is also found in the teaching of the Invisibles. Quote, there is no longer any need to accept the conditions under which former contemplations were obliged to function. It is to be the free swing of the athlete and not the labored tread of the weary monk, unquote. It's the same message Ralph Waldo Emerson delivered almost exactly 100 years earlier in his, at the time, shocking commencement speech at Harvard Divinity School. Quote, a snowstorm was falling around us. The snowstorm was real. The preacher, merely spectral. And the eye felt the sad contrast in looking at him. And then out of the window behind him into the beautiful meteor of the snow. He had lived in vain. He had no one word intimating that he had laughed or wept, was married or in love, had been commended or cheated or chagrined. If he had ever lived and acted, we were none the wiser for it, unquote. Emerson also understood that the cure for spiritual anemia is spiritual contact, and nature is a splendid way to get spiritual contact. Just taking a moment to appreciate bird song or translucent leaves glistening on a sunny day can begin the natural process of re-energizing our lives. Now let us consider the spiritual problem of oversensitivity. Another danger of the spiritual path, one related to spiritual anemia, is oversensitivity. Some follow their spiritual preoccupations into realms of specialization and isolation that all but remove them from society. This is a bit like falling asleep in the lab when what you really wanted to do was experiment. The Invisibles warned us, quote, "The individual who sits alone, even though thinking exaltedly, accomplishes little for his generation beyond exemplifying the sublime. The limitation of this method of spreading one's influence is its wastefulness in proportion to one's effort and intent." Unquote. Eloquent about the virtues of a person who can integrate the spiritual and the physical, the Invisibles paint a picture of how much richer life can be. Quote, "On the other hand, the same type of mind capable of entering the stream of life, of participating in the trivial pleasures and interests and pastimes of his fellow beings, of amalgamating with their main purposes, which are their heart impulses, not their surface minds, this person's influence is incalculable. His harmonious intent and radiating, perceptive interest in life touch countless lives beyond his vision." Unquote. The Invisibles remind us that having interests in common with our fellow travelers through space-time makes it all possible. Quote, "And so I repeat, you must have bonds of genuine, intense interest with your fellow beings. You must cultivate them, be proficient in them, if you are to achieve anything approaching the effectiveness of which you are capable." Unquote. But the Invisibles are not without empathy for sensitive souls overwhelmed by confusion in a confusing world. Quote, "Sensitiveness capable of absorbing wisdom through direct impression suffers enormously from the world of combat. For as awareness increases, so does suffering. A wider vision reveals not only rightness, but also the terrible wrongness. Because of this, unfortunately, the spiritual aspirant often prefers to seek a sheltered life and become a bystander." Unquote. The Invisibles describe the result. Quote, "Unwilling to make what seem to him futile efforts at righting things, he prefers the refuge of passivity. Such a person may have an exquisitely sensitized vision, but he is absolutely sterile because of lack of human contact." Unquote. Pulling back to capture the big picture, the Invisibles reveal the consequences of such isolation, judging harshly. Quote, "One reason why the strength of unenlightenment is rampant is this shrinking of sensitiveness from contact with it. The bystander probably considers it fastidiousness, but it is really inertia, atrophied force, overcultivation, loss of productiveness." End quote. In Across the Unknown, Betty discussed an example of this type of oversensitivity. Quote, "I want to look at him again," she said, referring to someone never named. Quote, "He's quite fascinating, quite exquisite, but useless. If set in action, so much of him would break or crumble or change. What a pity he couldn't be used. He's such a highly developed specimen." Unquote. Quote, "He's got to learn to take his sensitiveness out of the way or he can't be put to work." Unquote. The Invisibles responded. Quote, "Suppose he's trying to accomplish something and everybody begins irrelevant personal attacks, obstructions of all kinds. The minute he becomes susceptible to that, he is automatically shut off from the power current which was going to help him." Unquote. The Invisibles give this advice to the oversensitive. Quote, "When things go wrong, abandon all contemplation of your problem in detail and recall your activities to the center of your being." Unquote. With the help of higher consciousness and spiritual stability, we are able to see clearly the possible solutions to most situations. Now, what did Betty mean by the spiritual sense as opposed to the five senses? Betty attempted to explain how our five senses compare to her spiritual senses in the Unobstructed. Quote, "It is more as if my whole body were a kind of sight. Feeling and sensation come nearer to it. I perceive with my sensation. I see with my mind and feelings quite distinctly in a kind of direct absorption of the realities around me. It is hard to make sense of it in words, but the main thing is that you are not at all dependent on any one little channel of information," unquote. The Invisibles explained further, quote, "The attempt to describe this faculty inevitably gives the impression of something vague and indeterminate. Actually, it is nothing of the sort. Nor is the acquisition of knowledge by its aid a hit or miss affair, a mere unregulated absorption of indiscriminate impressions. In practice, you are magnetically attracted toward whatever you are in need of at the moment," unquote. In the unobstructed universe, is the unobstructed universe then a world of synchronicity? Is synchronicity a glimpse of the unobstructed? Stewart advised that we, quote, "clearly envision," unquote, the goal of spiritual awareness. We concentrate on that without worrying about details or the steps needed to accomplish it. The details, quote, "will automatically present themselves if the aim is held long enough and steadily enough," unquote. The Invisibles elaborated. "All things in the universe constantly flow through you, awaiting only your choice and arrestment." We'll look at that word and define it more carefully in a future episode. Music, for instance, is all around you, like electricity, needing for its manifestation only the apparatus for trapping it. The room you sit in is filled with music, though you are deaf to it. But anybody with the proper equipment can pick it out of the air, just as you pick electricity out of the air. There is very little difference. In either case, one works to cooperate with unseen forces. Only with the music, in place of metals and vacuum tubes and dynamos, one utilizes intention, nerve relaxation, expansion of mind, the spiritual tuning which puts into operation the magnetic attraction of music. I do not want to complicate the picture with further details, but the same principle applies to every other creative field. It is the unrecognized commonplace of all successful achievement, unquote. Quote, "Thoughts are things," the Invisibles added. "Most thoughts are like skyrockets that quickly sputter and fail. But thoughts dwelled on or otherwise energized can have more force. While Betty said we do more to influence success in our lives by our daily demeanor, thoughts create a kind of weather in which we operate. If storm or drought are the only conditions, not only success, but life itself can become difficult. But thoughts can be useful in many ways if we use them rather than being used by them. For example, Betty shares her visualization for removing the rubble in our way, our traumas, failures, disappointments, blame, and shame, and the other sorrows of the past that overshadow the present. Such experiences are food for the soul, she explained. Quote, "We ingest experience," unquote, the Invisibles agreed, quote, "as the sustaining nutriment of life. That nutriment is assimilated as the body assimilates food. By means of it, we are empowered to fill out one level of consciousness so that we may rise to the next," unquote. Betty used the image of herself standing with a comical amount of baggage, so much luggage dragged with her everywhere she goes. But now she can hand it all over. Not only will she be liberated from the burden, but her soul, that superior yet subtle center of herself, will receive nourishment and be the better for the experience. We are told to surrender memories of suffering, but not in a cavalier fashion. Rather, in the faith that our own greater wisdom will process our experiences while we go on living in the present instead of the past. We are in the lab to experiment. Later, we'll take that deep dive into the results. Now, let's look at aging and what the Invisibles called other Neanderthal superstitions. The Invisibles talked about two Neanderthal superstitions that inhibit human life. The first is the belief that youth, physical beauty, and strength are more important than anything else. The second is that aging enfeebles the mind and soul. Quote, to put it roughly, the Invisibles explained, quote, the contagion of youthful beauty of body, lovable, universally adored, must somehow be translated into your spiritual youth. It needs more puppiness on your part, more careful play, unquote. Stewart explained that older people make the mistake of trying to use their bodies to recapture the glories of youth, quote. If you're going to face a great and shining future, you must use a new and bright apparatus with which to express your greater capacities, unquote. The ripened soul is the seed that survives the withered pod that was once a flower. As the soul develops, whatever limitations the body faces need not restrict the full flight of the awakening self. But we are constantly bombarded with messages about the suffering we should expect as we grow older. Betty put it this way, quote, as long as we allow those old flesh thoughts to sit around like old black crows, just spoiling the party, we'll never be able to believe in the fruit of our life. It will be obscured by the age of our arteries, denied by the stiffness of our muscles, and every other old killjoy in our bodies, unquote. The Invisibles asked, quote, why saturate your whole being with a sensation that has to do with only a smaller part of you? Even when the body is tired, there's no longer any need for you to live in its tiredness. Just take the sensible measures appropriate to a tired body and then withdraw into your higher serenities, unquote. The Invisibles continued, quote, or even today, certainly, the old man who acts in forward-looking vigor is numbered perhaps by hundreds, as against untold millions living in wistfulness of vanished youth. The average man, meanwhile, is engaged in expending the accumulations made at the peak of youth, spreading them thin over the years until at last he stands bankrupt before his gray remaining days, searching half-heartedly for some real interest, real enough to carry him through, unquote. The soul should not be subject to the body's decline. Quite to the contrary. The Invisibles explained, quote, the gift of illumination of the moment is how to substitute for bodily functions the higher intelligence and vital intensities of the enduring being within you, unquote. Since the soul is the source of all vitality, as spiritual contact grows, we can experience a greater vitality of mind and emotions, of empathy and of appreciation for the great experiment that is life. But there's more to it than that. The Invisible suggested that we inherit a belief in aging. Quote, age, in a sense, is self-inflicted, a legacy from past generations. But within each, there is something that is superior to age. Once you fully realize this, there will be no tradition of age to uphold. It will exist only as a physical cycle, quite apart from the real center of being, unquote. The Invisibles pointed out a way around the obstacles of middle and old age. Quote, old age or middle age is a too heavy sensing of discipline and accepting of its limitations as a wall and not as a channel in which we can run as vigorously as ever. When we are slowed down or headed off in our former directions, we should just concentrate ourselves on the direction we can go in. This form of spiritual contact can improve how we experience aging. Betty added, quote, "You can continue to quicken yourself wholesomely, naturally, normally in every faculty, physical, mental, spiritual, each year freeing yourself, moving toward youth instead of age, the youth of your next and higher phase of life," unquote. Study alone won't accomplish it. Betty continued, quote, "It doesn't come through thinking. It isn't thinking. It's doing, like physical exercises. Only these are everything: will, sensory, every kind of pleasurable participation in living vitally," unquote. We can also learn how to get along better with our bodies, which have their own needs and agendas. The Invisibles explained, quote, "You learn not to arouse its combative simulations, but to give it ease and consideration, even to pamper it excessively in order to gain its cooperation. See if you cannot transfer the vigor and abandon of youth, its enthusiasm for adventure, into the mental and spiritual integration you have acquired," unquote. Or as Stewart wrote in With Folded Wings, quote, "Once you grasp it clearly, you will find you have within you a fountain of eternal youth," unquote. Now let's look at death and the afterlife, according to Betty. Betty gave us this description of the experience of death, quote, "There is nothing to dying, just a tickly sensation, that's all. It is like sunrise when you're camping out, the coming of color and illumination to widen spaces that were darkened, and enlarging and defining of the pattern of your own life," unquote. The Invisibles added, quote, "Why not say as to death that the life of each species is imprisoned in its fruit? Each fruit, the flesh, is the bearer of the seed. Why not think of your own seed of life within your flesh in the same way? The flesh is only the bearer of the seed to further development," unquote. You've perhaps heard of the astral body, the body we are supposed to inhabit after death or during dreams or other travels away from the physical. Betty suggests the term beta body, defined as, quote, "the form attribute of that frequency, which is an individual consciousness, an I am. It is integral, atomic, and non-cellular," unquote. What we live in daily in our obstructed universe, Betty called the alpha body. Quote, "The form attribute of a combination of frequencies constituting the physical housing in the obstructed universe of an individual consciousness," unquote. Betty reported that the beta body is a body of light and color unique to each soul's frequency and stage of spiritual evolution. The voice of the beta body is sonorous with the music of the spheres. She elaborated, quote, "Your beta body is not multicellular, not composed of numerous entities. It is integral and expresses only your individual identity. Primary entities are indivisible," unquote. Our physical bodies are conglomerate reflections or shadows of these bodies of light. Quote, "Your alpha body, the temple of the body that you, the you with a capital Y, the I am, the being with a capital B, inhabits for a period of sidereal time, is divisible, for it is made up of innumerable low degrees, entities of consciousness." What's it like then to cross over at death? Betty commented, quote, "In the first place, when you come here, one of the things that astounds you most is the lack of difference," unquote. She reported that life in the unobstructed was much more vibrant than life as we know it. In a sense, we are the dead, they the living. Quote, think of the most alive and intensely exciting moment of your life, unquote, Betty suggested, quote, and make it a whole day or a week, and you will know how I feel over here, unquote. There, they enjoy a freedom that we cannot grasp. Betty's prose became poetic as she described this greater freedom. Quote, it would take a poet or an angel to express it because we do not know how to partake of this super happiness. I get just a breath of it when I lie down next to the earth and sniff it, and I get just a taste of it when I come in on the waves and the salt is on my lips, and I get just a whisper of it when I stay still in the woods and listen. And I get the most of it when I love something, even my dog or my garden, unquote. Betty tries to explain an experience that defies definition with mere words. Spiritual joy in the presence of nature opens our hearts and minds and gives us vitality, energy that is essential to being effective in the world. Quote, I want so much to sink deep, dive, be absorbed in this intense reciprocity, this thing I can't even name. It must be experienced and entered completely in order to have practical understanding and sympathy and accomplishment in the material world. It gives an endless vista, unquote. But this limitless consciousness can also explore any limitation. Quote, it's just like magic, Betty explained. Quote, with this control, I could instantly dematerialize myself so as to be sensitive only to the most delicate vibrations of spirit. And then at a moment's notice, I could shift right back to something absolutely external and objective, like a game of tennis. It's just as simple as changing the focus of a microscope to different levels in its depth of field, unquote. Betty elaborates on the freedom of her state of being. With this magical power, one could partake of every life that exists. It is really just a matter of withdrawing your attention from one thing and giving it full strength to another. A moment ago, for instance, I withdrew all attention from my body, left it in the corner, and walked off in my spiritual body. It was just as simple as that, unquote. This quote from Ennead 6 by the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus describes the same experience. The she that he is talking about is the soul. Quote, if she were able to be spun around by her own effort or by the good fortune of being turned by Athena herself, she will find herself face to face with the deity, with herself, and with the universe. She will not understand at first that she looks at the universe, but when she finds she can neither locate nor define herself or her limits, then, giving up the definition of herself as a thing separate from all being, she will, without moving, enter the entire universe by staying there where the universe is rooted, unquote. According to the Invisibles, reincarnation is a fact. While the seed of individuality remains the same, the circumstances of incarnation create distinct personalities that in most cases would be unrecognizable as related identities. Plotinus held the same belief. As C.I. Tripathi wrote about the philosophy of Plotinus, quote, so long as we do not attain the highest wisdom, we are bound to successive rebirths, which are like one dream after another, or sleep in different beds, unquote. The meaning of life. The Epic of Atrahasis is the most complete Mesopotamian account of the myth of the Great Flood and the Ark. It was written in the 17th century BC in Assyria, over 1,000 years before the story of Noah. The epic tells the story of a revolt by the lesser gods against the greater. The hard labor and relentless repetition required to keep the world going were too much even for deities. So the Assyrian gods created human beings to handle the drudgery. Stewart described necessary drudgery as, quote, spiritual calisthenics, unquote. Drudgery is harm prevention. According to Stewart, who was himself quite wealthy, when the wealthy avoid the experience of drudgery, they lose essential life lessons and opportunities for evolution. The Invisibles did not shy from the question that would later become the name and theme of a film by Monty Python. What is the meaning of life? The Invisibles explained that in the unobstructed, the urge to help something good happen is as strong as the sexual urge is here. Quote, this is the great strong instinct that carries on the spiritual world. You must get something to put in the void beneath you. It is the first big urge. Get busy. Fix this mess you see under you. And when you realize how useless and futile you are, you try hard and experiment until you acquire something with which to work, unquote. The Invisibles agreed with the teachings about consciousness given by an American soldier killed in World War I, Stephen, who became famous when Joan and Darby published Our Unseen Guest. Stephen reported, quote, when you come here and your eyes are unsealed, those who meet you will seem quite natural and quite human, as indeed we are. In fact, we are more human than you, as you now know yourself, ever dreamed of being. We are humanity intensified many times, unquote. According to Stephen, consciousness has both quality and quantity. The quality of consciousness manifests specific types or species. The tree quality of consciousness makes trees. The pine tree quality of consciousness makes pine trees. The antelope quality of consciousness makes antelopes. Quote, in the unobstructed universe, quality is in evolution and therefore in degrees. In the obstructed universe, it is a fixed potential in its given degree, unquote. So an eagle can't change her quality into that of a human being in the obstructed, but she can become a perfected eagle. Quantity of consciousness can be developed, quote, by the individual in evolution and therefore in degrees, end quote. When we have absorbed all the quantity of consciousness our degree of quality allows, we evolve to the next. Imagine a light that emits a beautiful sound and irresistible magnetism. It spontaneously attracts around it the chaos of formless bits of matter, lighting them up, organizing them into elegant functions, like a symphony, transforming separate elements of an orchestra into unity and harmony. When the light moves away, chaos resumes, and all the once mutually dependent pieces fall again into disorganization. But each of these individual bits carries within it the experience of cooperation with a higher consciousness and the urge to itself become such an individualized center of creation. That can be accomplished only by developing quantity of consciousness at each degree of quality of consciousness, all the way up the evolutionary ladder. According to Plotinus, at the far horizon of our understanding, we encounter the good, the true, and the beautiful. But what is beauty? Why do we find it so hypnotic? Why has it for so long been a symbol of spirituality, but also of temptation? Stewart wrote, quote, anything in the world consists of two things, in spite of the underlying unity. We have the life force of a thing and the material manifestation of that life force. Now, very simply, beauty is an exuberance of that life thing beyond the mere mechanical need of producing a manifestation, unquote. Stewart's next two paragraphs, perhaps, were among those that caused Jung to comment on the American perspective on the afterlife enshrined in the Betty books. Quote, When this subtle, outspringing basic quality is so abundant, so overflowing, so vital, so oversufficient that it not only models and molds and shapes its material into the forms of itself, but has to spare, so to speak, we have beauty. When the life force is not proportioned to the stubbornness of the material through which it pushes the pattern of itself, when it is so lacking in vitality that it barely suffices to shadow itself forth in form, then we have ugliness. This applies through all that we call aesthetics. It applies to material things of this world as we look about and see them. It applies also to the productions of men, unquote. As a wealthy man, Stewart then used a metaphor that may come across as entitled when he explains why people who don't put enough energy into spirituality have little to work with. Quote, if a man has spiritual capital enough, he can afford, and he delights in, the ornamentation of his structure. If he is straitened for funds, he creates a shed to contain merely his utilities. Aside from the cadence of another era when industrial capitalism still ruled the hearts of patriots, Stewart's message here is meant to encourage individual creativity. He's saying that if we do not have spiritual energy, then we really don't have the desire to do all the things that we can to beautify life and the world. According to the Invisibles, beauty is an important force in our world. Quote, the sum total of those efforts, whether in a humble crocheted lamp mat, or in an attempt at stage effects in the theater, or in an honest though pathetic effort at decorating a hotel lobby, or a flower over the flower girl's ear, all make in the aggregate a formidable force of onward pushing construction, which, even though scattered and comparatively unmarked, go far to overbalance the spectacular, disheartening destructions that get into the newspaper headlines and worry everybody with the idea that the country is going to the dogs, unquote. Does that sound familiar? This is a subtle and gentle way of life. No one is to be forced or argued into believing anything. Each individual has his or her own path. Sharing enlightenment is neither a crusade nor a get-rich-quick scheme. The Invisibles asked the big question and answered it. Why are you being given light? To distribute so quietly and unobtrusively that it will arouse no resentment or resistance. In The Job of Living, the invisible Stewart named Gaelic says, quote, the beauties of things teach you how to liberate your spirit. You ask how you can feel free and happy. Can you not relive the moments you responded most keenly to beauty? Unquote. Beauty is a principal attribute of the unobstructed. In The Road I Know, Betty elaborated in a poetic passage. Could you imagine a substance made out of spring? Not of individual fresh willows and buds and blossoms and tender greens and bursting colors, not those details, but the very sweep of an entire world decked out, the substance of spring. Don't you see how fresh, delicious, exciting, exalting it would be compared to ordinary things? I am in this superlative beauty and freshness and exquisite delicacy. The Invisibles advised us, quote, we would like you to cultivate to the utmost your instinct for beauty, form, poems, anything that has been achieved by man in his brief moments of triumph and contact with the oversoul. It is the biggest uplifting material thing you can possess. Do not be afraid to drink deep of beauty. It is an open door through which you can glimpse what is to come. Beauty, all that is harmony and in opposition to discord, unquote. Stewart added, quote, the appreciation of beauty in the sense of a surrender to its influence rather than a critical analysis is another example of what I mean by simple spiritual contact, unquote. The Invisibles added, Quote, it is the biggest uplifting material thing you possess. Some may find the hidden spark in a jewel, others in a temple drum or a Buddha. Beauty is a great and quiet teacher. But what I am asking here is that in your response to beauty, you notice the difference between the outgoing, expanded feel of you and the indrawn, close huddled concentration of ordinary affairs. Beauty and love, unquote. This might be dismissed as a lukewarm homily, so the invisibles remind us what they mean when they use that word love. Quote, you hear us say love so often that the word ceases to convey any idea to you, but it is the all-containing, permeating essence which will unite your world to ours. We wish we had another word for it, but we see it as the first principle of growth. Open the floodgates. Let the great current of the universe pour through you to others if you would live, unquote. We may get the impression that we must be on all the time to be beautiful, to be spiritual, but no. We are told that there's a rhythm to everything, including creativity and spirituality. The Invisibles advised us to, quote, accept the recession into the quiet hollows as part of the great rhythm, without which there would be stagnation. Learn to take it as the repose period, the gathering period, the period in which the mighty forces that lift the wave upward are quietly, powerfully coming in. If you could only once feel this, visualize it, never again could you be uneasy, depressed, low-spirited, discouraged, merely because of the natural, inevitable, necessary ebb after the flow. Never again would you worry, because in this or that, your powers of today are not your powers of yesterday, that your wings are folded, that a darkness seems to have closed you about. Accept the quiet, accept the ebb, enjoy it, as all harmonious things should be enjoyed. Rest in confidence with your folded wings, unquote. Accepting the emptiness, including drudgery, and even the dark night of the soul, we can become more open to spiritual influx. The Invisibles promised that we will find that soon we'll once again, quote, be swept upward by the glittering crests whence all horizons are far, and the whistling winds of eternity tempt again your outspread wings, unquote. Over and over, a pitcher and a bowl, Betty added. Quote, over and over, a pitcher and a bowl. You fill the pitcher to your measure, and you empty it into the world, the bowl. There's a rhythm over and over again, filling and emptying, filling and emptying, a rhythm like a great pulse, unquote. As we have seen, the Invisibles addressed the meaning of life with these words, quote, one's function is to help conduct a flow, unquote. That brings us to the end of part 6. Tamra and I hope that you enjoyed it and that you find inspiration in it. Part 7, Attention is Existence, Further Instructions from the Invisibles, will include more information about how we spiritually absorb life experiences, some hints about unobstructed business practices, and ghostly experiments conducted by Stewart and Betty and their friends. If you enjoyed this, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe, or share so that we know that you want more. Thank you for spending time with us. Now, we hope that you find your way to the unobstructed.